talking to Col Moreton today about his new book, which is out on what date?
April the 6th.
April the 6th, so it's a burning urgency. It's called...
Is God Still an Englishman? I'll give you the subtitle too, shall I?
Go on.
How we lost our faith but found new soul.
Okay, so is this a book more about God or about the English?
The two are quite closely intertwined, I think, always have been, at least for the last 500 years. Belief and self-belief have gone hand in hand in the way the English have defined themselves, although I should say what I really mean is the way that the establishment, the church, the state and the crown have defined Englishness.
How did you come up with it, the idea?
I started writing about my own journey from certainty as effectively a very bumptious, obnoxious, convinced teenage fundamentalist into a place of confusion and ambiguity, and then on from that to something else. And I started writing memoiry stuff, and then actually looked around and thought, hang on, it's not just me. A friend of mine died a couple of years ago, and before she died she asked me, where am I going? Which, being an idiot, I said, up the A22, because it was the best way home. And she looked at me and said, no, that's not what I mean. And I thought, oh, right, okay. It's like kicking the guts, really. And I didn't know what to say, and this is the point. I had nothing to say to her. We had both once been absolutely convinced of faith, but I didn't know what to say. And it was that experience that got me thinking, hang on a minute, where did all my certainty go? And then when I started to think about my certainty, I started to think about the certainty of the society around me. The fact that when I was a kid we sang All Things Bright and Beautiful in school. The national anthem was played at the end of the films, the pictures. And there was still this assumption that the country that I was growing up in was a Christian country. And that it was one country, one monarch, one God, and all those certainties have all disappeared much more recently than people think, within the last generation, really. And I wanted to know where they'd gone, how they'd been demolished, and excitingly, what comes next.
So do you think we are most of the way through the uncertainty to a different kind of certainty, or are we just learning to live with the uncertainty?
I think that we went through a period around the millennium, really, where we didn't know what to say. And I think you can probably point to the awful millennium prayer that was cooked up to be said at the Dome, which was... And
it wasn't written by Cliff Richard. Okay.
No. Well, let's talk about that awful millennium prayer if you want.
Let's not do that.
But, there was this thing cooked up, by a bunch of people to be said at the Dome with Tony Blair and the Queen. I was actually at the Dome on New Year's Eve, and I have to tell you, it was the emptiest, strangest, most soul-free space that I've ever occupied in my life. And part of it was this prayer, which was really just people saying to a non-specific God, thanks, and can we have some more, please? It was nothing. There was nothing there, really. It wasn't clear about who it was addressing, and it wasn't really clear about what its purpose was, other than to have something that everyone could say. I think that I would take that as an emblem of the period of vacuity and uncertainty, the emptiness that was behind Tony Blair's eyes that night. Okay.
Now, obviously, when you've got that kind of uncertainty and vacuum, lots of people come in and are certain, and while we're talking about the English, there's all sorts of movements. I mean, I'm thinking of UKIP just in the last couple of days. We've had, Nick Griffin's had a good year or a bad year, depending on which point of view you're taking. So there's been various forms of English certainty. There's a lot more George Crosses around than there were this time 10 years ago. So how do you deal with those forms of certainty?
Well, because the second part, the answer to the question that you asked me about whether we're in a period of uncertainty or certainty, is that I think we're now moving into a period where people are starting to try to claim parts of Englishness and English cultural identity for themselves. BNP is an obvious example, the English Defence League is an obvious example. And I think that the way for people to combat that, if you like, to counter that, is not to say, as quite a lot of people on the left and in liberal circles would have us do, to concentrate on our Britishness, this kind of nebulous idea of the kingdom, which actually is disintegrating in front of our eyes, not least because, quite properly, the Scots and the Irish and the Welsh are coming to terms with their own national identity and celebrating that, and hats off and more power to their elbows. The English are left there with the kind of remnants of our imperial guilt, suddenly being inclusive of a whole range of cultures and gods and faiths and ways of being and foods and musics and things that we didn't have 20 or 30 years ago. And some people are frightened by that and want to put down the shutters and want to resist it. And some people, myself included, want to say, actually, that debate's over. It's not as if we could suddenly put up the shutters and turn England back into something pure, because it never was anything pure anyway. But now, in a time when children are 6 times more likely than their parents to be mixed race, we are already in a multi-ethnic, multi-faith culture that cannot be separated. So, what to do? Well, you can lament if you want. I'd rather celebrate. I'd rather say Englishness is changing, is developing, is becoming this rainbow thing. We are, as I say in the book, we're Morris dancers with maypoles, but we're also dubstep and dancehall. You know, we're roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, but we're also chicken balti, which was made in Birmingham. So we're all of these things, and all of those things are identifiably and definitely English now. They're new English certainties. And so that's who the English are. And it's really a question of whether people begin to recognise and celebrate that, or whether they want to go on complaining about it.
So almost what we're replacing is this slightly odd, but we've got used to it, notion of the Union, which is to do with the United Kingdom, with something more like a mix or a mashup, which is much more definably English.
Yeah, I think so. I think because the Scots, the Irish and the Welsh are doing so much good work in becoming more confident and more aware of who they are. And actually, within that, you can see that in Scotland, actually, that confidence is an inclusive confidence. So there will be people who say, you're wrong, you should come down my street and see the tension there. And I understand that there's a lot of sound and fury going on, there's a lot of trouble going on. But on another level, being an Asian and Scottish person is not an issue. I have a friend who is identifiably Sikh, identifiably Asian, identifiably Glaswegian, and very funny as it happens. And he's all of those things, and the Scottishness, the powerfulness of the Scottishness, seems, from what I can see of him, to be as powerful as any of the other cultural elements that he has. For the English, that's more difficult in a way, because we've been afraid or reluctant to engage with our Englishness and celebrate it. We're a bit sniffy about it, frankly. Morris dancing is a good example. People think it's a joke, and I think it is a joke to one extent. The hanky waving makes me laugh, right? But there's a whole other thing going on with the Morris, which is actually about people saying, we can use this as a kind of symbol of resistance, if you like, a way of sticking fingers up at people who want us to be one way, and celebrating a rowdy, a bawdy, iconoclastic version of Englishness, which has always been there, but which has been really under the thumb of the establishment for 5 centuries.